Hello AS, welcome to your first bit of flipped learning. Hopefully you're being very organised and doing this over Christmas. However, if you left it till after Christmas, that's absolutely fine too. The first thing we're going to look at is social learning theory, and that's the only thing we're going to look at today. So all you need to do is make notes on social learning theory. Social learning theory came about as it bridges the gap, and this is really, really important. The students who do well understand this kind of progression, and sometimes for the students who perhaps don't, it hinders their progress a little bit. So do make an additional note about this one somewhere on your books. You've got Wundt, who was the first person to kind of move philosophy away from psychology, so conducted controlled experiments. The behaviourists took the idea of controlled experiments, but they said they didn't like the idea of conducting research. They didn't think research was scientific unless you looked only at observable behaviours. They weren't interested in internal mental processes. They said, no, you can't study that, it's not scientific enough. The next thing that then came from there is social learning theory. And social learning theory looks at observable behaviours. It wants to see how people behave. It also looks and considers the environment as being the biggest impact. So much like behaviourist approach, it says the environment is the thing that influences our behaviour, looking at something slightly different, some slightly different things, and we'll look at the key terms in a minute. However, one thing social learning theory does acknowledge, which links in with the next approach you're going to look at, is cognitive approach. Behaviourist approach is it's all observable behaviours. Nothing happens in the mind in the middle, what we call the little black box, the mind in the middle. You get a stimulus and you respond to it. So the examples we've looked at, Pavlov's dogs saw the food and they responded to it. There was no thought process in the middle. The cognitive approach is all about the little black box, so all about what happens in the mind and how we think. Social learning theory is a mixture of the two. It suggests that we get stimuluses and we observe stimuluses and we respond to them, but there's also the internal mental processes, the little thought processes in between that happen as well, and that bridges the gap. And chronologically it runs on. The behaviourist approach was the 20s, 30s, 40s is the strongest kind of view of psychological theory, and then we had something called a paradigm shift, or the start of a paradigm shift. So paradigm is something that everybody accepts in a science, like the Earth is flat was originally what was accepted, and then there was a paradigm shift to the belief the Earth was round. So social learning theory is an example of paradigm shift gradually happening. So the accepted thing at the moment with the behaviourists is it's all external, it's all everything we learn from our environment, and there is a paradigm shift towards it being about internal mental processes, our thought processes, not just what can be observed, and social learning theory is part of that. Paradigm shifts are words that are you need to know for features of science at A2. So if you can just store those in the back of your mind, that would be really good. I'll make some notes on them. So social learning theory suggests we learn through the process of observation and imitation. So you've got the O in social for observation, and then you've got the I afterwards for imitation. I don't know what to tell you about the C in the middle. So O for observation, and so we observe and then we imitate people's behaviour. You could also talk about model. We model people's behaviour. It's just a fancy word for copy. Whenever you want to use the word copy when you talk about social learning theory, replace it with imitate or model. And then if you ever want to use the word see, replace it with observe. Okay, so social learning theory, we observe behaviours and imitate them. And it's the behaviours of role models. Now, role models, much like I said, positive and negative, reinforcement doesn't mean good or bad in this case. So normally we talk about role models as being good people who kind of are very positive. You can have the word role model just means someone that the child observes, so somebody who displays a behaviour that can be observed and copied. So we might not want the child to follow this person, we don't want them to be a role model, we don't want them to copy them, but actually the child observes and imitates, and the focus on social learning theory is how we learn as children, although we try and apply it to adults as well. So the role model is just a fancy word for the person who displays the behaviour. Something that's key about the role model, that why children follow certain role models, is because of identification. And the most stereotypical view of identification is gender. So generally we find that boys identify with men and girls identify with women, and of course now there's a huge range of different genders and kind of gender identities, and generally would find that people would identify most with a role model, so somebody who also identifies as the same gender. Or it could be something else. So it could be they're from the same hometown. So if you think about all the fuss that probably your school made when the Olympics happened with all the people from the local area, that's them trying to get you to identify with them, make a link with them. Oh, they're the same as me, they're from the same place, they're the same age as me, the same gender as me, whatever it might be. Okay, and then vicarious reinforcement. So this is continuing with the behaviourist approach. However, they are saying with when they talk about reinforcement, it increases. It's about talking about increasing a behaviour. Behaviourist theory is all about direct reinforcement. So you either have something added or something taken away, and you experience that directly. Social learning theory is we observe someone else receiving the reinforcement, and then which then makes us more likely to display the behaviour. For example, in college, I know we give £5 Amazon reward vouchers. The idea is that you would receive someone else getting that reward, and you would think, oh, I want that reward too. I'm going to increase my attendance as well. Or in lesson, if you hear see someone, generally works more for primary school, but possibly even beyond that, even to the staff maybe, you see somebody answering a question and the teacher saying, well done, that was brilliant, what a good answer, what a well thought out answer, and then you think, I want that too, and then you try and mirror and copy and model, so model would be the fancy word, that behaviour to get the same reward. So you're vicariously reinforced. Vicarious means if you live vicariously through somebody, we talk a lot about parents living vicariously through their children. So for example, really stereotypical, a dad possibly wanted to play football at a really high level and wasn't able to for whatever reason, was forced to go and work in retail or I don't know, something like that. And then because of that, he never got that chance. He then pushes his son because he wants to live to become a footballer, because he wants to live vicariously through him. He wasn't able to do it, but he can watch and observe and see somebody else. So he's kind of living through them. And vicarious means experiencing something happening to someone else. So vicarious reinforcement, seeing somebody else receive a reward and it reinforcing, increasing your behaviour. The behaviour you've seen in them, you increase it. And then there's the role of mediational process, and this links with the internal. The phrase we will use for cognitive approach is internal mental processes, which basically means the way we think, anything that happens in our brain, our thought processes. So all of those things before, observation, imitation, role models, identification, vicarious reinforcement, are all external things to our behaviour. So exactly like the behaviourist approach, apart from they were saying they were indirect reinforcement. Now we're going to look at the role of mediational process, which social learning theory acknowledges, which is what happens in what we call the little black box. So our minds, as opposed to something we can directly observe. The role of mediational process means that we have to pay attention. So we must be paying attention to the behaviour. We must have the ability to retain it, to hold it in our memory. We must be able to remember it. We must be able to reproduce the behaviours ourselves, and we must be motivated to carry out that behaviour. And it says, for example, a reward. So here it would be the vicarious reinforcement and seeing the reward and wanting that reward yourself. So, for example, using the example of football, you must be willing to pay attention to the behaviour. So that's why some people, they would see someone playing really good football and they wouldn't they wouldn't be motivated, or they wouldn't want to do the same because they're not paying attention to it, they're not interested in it. However, if you like football, you would pay attention to the football. You would how they play football. You would have the ability to retain that in your memory. So, of course, if you're a very, very young child, say 6 months old, obviously you don't have the ability to do that. However, maybe 16, 17, 18, you've definitely got the ability to retain that information in your memory. You're also physically capable to reproduce it. So you feel quite fit and healthy. You know how to play football. If you're watching somebody with in sort of traditional mainstream football and you haven't got any disabilities, then of course you're able to reproduce it. And it'd be the same with the anything else. So if you were watching maybe someone playing football, there's a type of football where you don't need to be able to see, so you might be blind, and it would be about you can still reproduce that behaviour. You are capable of carrying out the behaviour that they are displaying because you know you can reproduce it, you know you've got that ability to, because they're showing the same kind of disability. I guess that would be a bad example if we're talking about observation, unfortunately. It was just the first one that came into my head. And the same with motivation, you must have a reason. So you can you paid attention to the football, you can remember how to play the football, you're able to reproduce it, and then you must be given a reason to. Well, maybe do your mates think it's good? You want to play football so you can get involved with your mates, or if it was the example of your dad might be rewarding you, cheering you on, saying how well you're doing, and that's really positive. So all of those words are mentioned on the specification. You could be asked to define any of them. Whenever you explain social learning theory, they should be the terms that you can use. If you aren't sure of any of them, I need you to stop the video, I need you to Google them or search for them and get some definitions and some examples, and you need to read some information in your book as well. I will be asking you to look at these terms quite closely. And there we go. We have you have the 4 important factors in the role of mediational process. So attention, paying attention to the role model, and then remembering what the role model did, having the ability to reproduce it, and then being motivated to reproduce it as well. And then here to really, really emphasize it, and this is a slide I've taken from a previous lesson, so you can see how much I was trying to cross one out. So in the behaviourist model, we say there's a stimulus and a response, and behaviourists say they're not interested whatsoever in the little black box. They're not interested in what happens in your brain, the way that you think. In the cognitive model, we have the input, we call it input, but it could be the stimulus as well. And then we have the output, the behaviour. So the input would be what's happening in our environment, our role model that we're observing, and then the output would be the imitation, the modelling that we are showing. And the social learning theorists are interested in the mediational process in the middle as well, and that's social learning theory. And as you can see, it's also cognitive, which we'll come back to. So they are interested in the internal mental processes, and that the step from behaviourist, social learning theory bridges the gap between behaviourism and cognitive psychology. So just to give you an idea, internal mental processes, the internal thought processes that occur between a stimulus and a response only exists in social learning theory. So Bandura believes that humans actively process information. They don't just see a stimulus and respond to it, they actually process it and understand it with attention, and think about that attention, retention, reproduction and motivation. ARRM, ARM. with an extended R. I don't know if you want to remember that bit, but there you go, it's ARRM. So an example here, if you were a behavioural psychologist, you would say there was no mediational process. Pavlov's dogs are just responding to the tuning fork uncontrollably, even after conditioning. So they don't think about it, they don't respond to it, they don't have any thought process, they hear the tuning fork and immediately they start to salivate, and that is it. If social learning theory, or if we applied mediational processes to it, then Pavlov's dogs would have heard the tuning fork, thought, I know what that means that signals food, got excited, and the salivary glands prepared them for the food. So this is just a comparison. I wouldn't talk about this, is to help you understand what mediational process means, the thought process in the middle. Don't necessarily use these examples, but you can get a feel for them. Because you wouldn't talk about mediational process in relation to Pavlov's dogs. No mediational process again, so there'd be no, we'd be completely ignoring it. It'd be the behaviourist approach. Students respond to being in a classroom by getting out their textbook and pens. So they, just for no apparent reason, when you sit down, you get out your textbook and pens. You're not thinking about it. There's no thought process going there. You just immediately respond to looking around, being in the classroom and taking everything out. And I'm sure some days you identify with that. However, most of the time your mediational process would be, I better get my books and pens out because we always make notes in this lesson. So you're thinking, right, last time we used it, and last time somebody didn't get their books out, they were told to or they were told off, and then you get your pens and books out to make it easier. No mediational process responds to a stimulus of being set homework by completing it. So the environment, the stimulus that I'm setting is giving is setting homework, and you just the response to having a stimulus. The stimulus of homework is just completing it. However, the mediational process goes, I better complete that homework, as last time Ben didn't and he got told off, and I don't want to get told off. So you're having a thought process. So it's homework, thought process, response, complete the homework. Whereas if it was no mediational process, it would be homework, complete it. You wouldn't think in the middle, it would just be a response to it. Okay, Examples, we've got Mohammed saw his older brother Oliver dealing drugs and making lots of money. So this is a really good example that I was given by someone that I used to tutor, and I really liked it, so I stole it. I hope they don't mind. So Mohammed saw his older brother Oliver stealing drugs and making lots of money. Mohammed thought he would like to make money too and started to deal drugs. This is an example of social learning theory, certainly not any life advice. So the thing they were imitating, the modelling that they were doing was that Mohammed was doing was drug dealing. The observation, he saw his brother, so he was observing, watching his brother. The role model was his brother. The vicarious reinforcement was his brother getting lots of money for the drug dealing. And then the reason he identified with the role model is because Mohammed, you could argue lots of different reasons, but Mohammed was male. Mohammed and Oliver were both male, and they both lived in the same kind of family. We talk about the term brother, so the same family home or whatever it might be. And the role of mediational process, it says Mohammed thought that he would like to make money too. So there was the thought process in there. There was the motivation. So he'd paid attention to the drug dealing behaviour. He'd been able to remember it. He was physically able to reproduce it. And then he was motivated. He wanted some money, so he's motivated to complete it. Another example, you've got RuPaul's Drag Race. So RuPaul's Drag Race, and the example we've got here is Lactatia, who watched RuPaul's Drag Race and saw the winners receiving prizes for completing the challenges, winning them, and being praised for having the best makeup. Lactatia thought it couldn't believe how glamorous they were and wanted that life, and she is now a famous young drag queen. And there's an example of RuPaul's Drag Race, and then she is just there. So we've got imitation, so the modelling behaviour that she's displayed is becoming a drag queen. The observation, watching RuPaul's Drag Race, so observing it, and then of course you've got all the other things that go along with that. The role models were RuPaul or the drag queens that were on the show, or both. The vicarious reinforcement, she saw them being rewarded for for having the best makeup, for winning the challenges. She saw them getting prizes and praise. She identified with them. There could have been a huge number of reasons. Obviously the most stereotypical one is the fact that they share the same gender. I'm sure there's possibly some other things, and I did try and do a little bit of research, but there could be lots of different things that kind of made her feel identify with the competitors on RuPaul's Drag Race. And then the role of mediational process, she thought about it and she wanted that life too. So paid attention to RuPaul's Drag Race, was physically able to retain that information. She's 8 or 9 now, I think, so obviously capable of retaining that information, physically capable of reproducing it. Clearly she's able to use makeup and was motivated by the prizes, by the praise, by wanting that lifestyle and that money. Okay, and there we go, we've got Mohammed again as an example there. The other thing I would now like you to do, if you pause the video, I'd like to watch the video of Bandura's research. Bandura is mentioned directly in the specification, so you could be asked a question about Bandura. I'd like to watch the video about Bandura's research and make some notes as one of the examples. You've got the 3 different shapes. I'd like to note down information about Bandura's piece of research and the role of mediational process, and that will be underneath this video on Moodle. So there is an additional video that you need to watch briefly and make some notes. Okay. Evaluation, so you've got specs, supporting evidence, practical applications, evaluation of methods, and contrast to other approaches. The supporting evidence is Bandura's research. If you were asked to describe and evaluate the social learning theory, which is one of the questions that's previously been asked, Bandura's research is what you would use for AO3 research. You would not use it for AO1. The only time you'd use Bandura's research for AO1 is if the question was describe and evaluate Bandura's research, not the social learning theory. You talk about all the other things we've used previously, and you use Bandura's research as AO3 supporting evidence. There's also Fox and Baleson, which is in your CAT book, and that is about the idea that people who observed virtual models were more doing exercise, were more likely to take part in exercise, and most importantly, people who observed virtual models that looked like themselves were even more likely to do exercise. So of course that links with the concept of identification. And if a theory has supporting evidence, that suggests that the theory has validity. Not any type. Theories do not have a type of validity as an internal, external, whatever. They just have obviously you don't say have or don't have, but you would have it either increases or reduces the validity of the theory. Okay, because the theory is claiming to explain something. If we test that, like Bandura and Fox and Bielsen have done, and we find that that is what they're explaining what they claim to explain, then that is validity. Practical applications. So social learning theory has been used in a variety of ways. The watershed was put in place, which it means that at 9 o'clock the expectation was that most children would be in bed, and I'll put some articles on or some links about the watershed if you have a quick Google. At 9 o'clock, that's when the programs change from more family-friendly programs to possibly programs with more adult themes. For example, violence, drug use, I don't know, any kind of behaviours like that, and that is to reduce the chances that children will observe and imitate those behaviours. The other type of practical application you can see is, I think it was in France, and again the video, the article, I'll share the article below the video on the online for you to have a quick look at, because it's a really, really interesting one, is the idea of social learning theory and size zero models. So that has been put in place, or there was discussion about putting in place certain models would only be allowed to model if they had a letter saying that from the doctor saying they were healthy. Another thing they put in place was models were only allowed to model if they met a certain body mass index, a BMI, so they had a certain amount of health, they were a healthy weight. And of course that's to avoid people, generally, again stereotypically but not always, young girls observing and imitating their behaviour. So they see them being rewarded with lots of beautiful clothes and lots of attention, and then they want to imitate that behaviour of being very, very thin. So that was designed to reduce that. So of course if the theory has practical applications, then it must be high in validity, because we've applied it to the real world and it's worked effectively. We can apply it to the real world. It does not have any kind of validity other than validity, so don't say internal, external, whatever. Evaluation of methods. So for example with Bandura, and you could talk generally, all social learning theorists, or a lot of social learning theorists, use children, which of course can't be applied to adult learning, so it can only really explain why children behave in a certain way. They're generally very, very artificial. So if you think about Bandura's research with the Bobo dolls, it's not a very natural kind of setting that children would usually be placed in, so we can't necessarily be confident of ecological validity. However, so there's the weaknesses. However, it was highly controlled because it was in a lab experiment, and as you know, that controls extraneous variables, increasing confidence in cause and effect, and increasing our confidence of internal validity, because we're talking about the methods now, so you can use the word internal validity. The sample, of course, an issue with population validity, so there are all different types of validity, and because they were mostly observations, it does allow us to get to check for inter-rater reliability, so they can use more than one observer, and therefore we can check it has inter-rater reliability and decide whether we're confident in the results. The other thing, however, a weakness, so you're going to contrast it with the other approaches, is it ignores biological factors. So it only focuses on the environment and how the environment impacts us. One of the examples of the biological factors that it ignores is it can't explain why people with high levels of testosterone are more likely to be aggressive, or, and this is something that links in with what you look at with Andy, people with a faulty MAOA gene, which has an impact, which then reduces the level of serotonin in the body, and as you know, serotonin is a neurotransmitter. So if we have a faulty gene that leads to low levels of serotonin, social learning theory cannot explain why some people, it shouldn't matter, it's all about their environment and who they can observe. It shouldn't matter whether they have high or low testosterone or a faulty MAOA gene or not. So therefore this suggests that the theory lacks some validity because it cannot explain all behaviours. Which is one of the problems. It claims to be able to explain how we learn to behave, but of course it cannot explain all of those behaviours because it ignores biological factors, reducing the validity. Once again, we're talking about the theory, so not a certain type of validity, just validity. Okay, brilliant, thank you very much.